The paradox of tolerance. This phrase has popped up a lot recently when discussing how we should deal with hate speech online or with people who hold extreme political views. But it's not actually a new idea. It was first written about by the philosopher Karl Popper almost 80 years ago in his work The Open Society and Its Enemies. And what he wrote still applies today. He said that if we try to build a society that is based around complete tolerance, then that society will ultimately be destroyed by the intolerant. This is obviously a paradox because tolerance is generally seen as a good thing and intolerance as a bad thing. So how can it be possible for something bad, like intolerance, to destroy something good, like a tolerant society? And is this even a real problem that we have to worry about today? Well, let's dive into it. Popper lived in a very different time to us. He was born in 1902, so he lived through the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe. And he saw firsthand the damage that these intolerant ideologies could do. So he wanted to write a book that would help prevent such atrocities from happening again. Now, in order to understand what he meant by the paradox of tolerance, we need to define our terms. What did he mean by tolerance? Well, according to Popper, tolerance means allowing people to express and believe whatever they want without fear of punishment from the state. So long as someone's behavior doesn't involve any force or fraud, then they should be free to do whatever they want. Popper also argued that tolerance shouldn't just apply to our political opponents or people with different lifestyles to us. We should also tolerate people who we think are misguided or even deeply wrong. This includes people who hold racist or anti-Semitic views, for example. When Popper talks about intolerance, he doesn't mean disagreeing with people or criticizing their ideas. Instead, he's talking about a desire to suppress other people's freedom of expression or even to punish them for what they say or what they believe. In other words, intolerance is when people want to use the coercive power of the state to stop others from expressing their opinions. So now we've defined our terms. How does this relate to the modern day? Well, Popper's main concern was that if we have a society that is committed to tolerance, then it wouldn't take very long before all that tolerance is abused and the society collapses into intolerance. For Popper, the problem starts when we allow intolerant people into our society. Let's imagine a society that allows anyone to come in and live there, regardless of their political views. Now, along comes some intolerant people who start spreading hateful propaganda and calling for the suppression of certain groups of people. Popper's argument is that if we don't stop this at the point where these people are just spreading ideas, but instead we allow them to continue, then they will eventually become powerful enough to start oppressing other people. And this is why Popper says that tolerance cannot be our ultimate goal. Instead, we should only tolerate those who are tolerant themselves. Popper also argued that this isn't really a difficult line to draw. Intolerant people will always cross it by calling for the suppression of other people's freedom of speech. So once they start doing that, we can no longer tolerate them. But some people might say that this isn't really tolerance at all. If we're only tolerant of those who are tolerant, then we're not being truly tolerant. And I can see where they're coming from. If we make a rule that we will only be tolerant of people who are tolerant, then that implies that we're not tolerant of intolerant people. So it seems like we're simply denying the possibility of these two things existing together, tolerance and intolerance. However, I think that this is a misunderstanding of what Popper meant. I don't think he was saying that tolerance and intolerance are mutually exclusive. Instead, he was saying that if we want our society to flourish, then we need to prioritize intolerance. If that means that sometimes we can't be tolerant of people who are intolerant, then so be it. That's the cost of living in a society that values freedom. I think that this is a necessary caveat to add to the idea of tolerance. There are certainly limits to tolerance. For example, if one group of people is calling for the suppression of another group, then it's perfectly reasonable to crack down on that. One person's intolerance towards another person is not something that we should tolerate. However, this leaves us with another question. How do we decide where to draw the line? After all, if you talk to most people, they will say that, of course, suppressing people's freedom of speech is wrong. But if you ask them, what about the guy who calls all black people lazy, or the woman who says that gay people should be locked up, then things get more complicated. It's easy to say that suppressing people's freedom of speech is wrong in general, but it's much harder to decide whether we should tolerate specific instances of speech. And this is why the paradox of tolerance is still relevant today. As soon as we start trying to apply the idea of tolerance to specific situations, we run into problems. Take, for example, the case of a guy who made a joke on Twitter that offended some people. Should he be punished for that? Well, it depends on whether we think that his joke was hateful or not. And this is exactly the sort of grey area that Popper was talking about. When we start to discuss specific cases like this one, the idea of tolerance becomes much less clear-cut. And this is why I think that we should be careful when applying the idea of the paradox of tolerance. Yes, it's true that if we allow intolerant people to spread their message, then they may become powerful enough to oppress others. But the same can be said of any group of people who are able to manipulate others into giving them power. You don't need to invoke the paradox of tolerance to explain why we should oppose fascism or Nazism. All you need is a basic understanding of human psychology. People are susceptible to manipulation. Some people are more susceptible than others, but we all are to some degree. And if we allow certain groups to spread hateful propaganda, then it's entirely possible that they could gain enough power to oppress others. But this isn't unique to intolerance. You could make the same argument about a group of people who spread fake news and conspiracy theories. They might start off as just a small group of people, but if we allow them to spread their message, then they could eventually become powerful enough to manipulate others and seize control. So while I agree with Popper that intolerance can be a problem, I don't think that it's nearly as big of a problem as he thought. And I also don't think that the solution is to abandon tolerance altogether. If we want to live in a free society, then we need to allow people to say controversial things. That's just part of living in a free society. It's uncomfortable, but that's the price we pay, and I don't think that this is a high price to pay. The bottom line is that yes, intolerance can be a problem. If we allow intolerant people to spread their message, then they could eventually become powerful enough to oppress others. But this is also true of many other things as well. So I don't think that the solution is to abandon tolerance. Instead, we should focus on making sure that people are aware of the dangers of intolerance and other forms of manipulation. If we can do that, then I think we can avoid the worst excesses of intolerance without sacrificing the benefits of tolerance. Do you think that Popper was right about the paradox of tolerance? Or do you think that it's not as big of a problem as he thought? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons and everyone else who supports this channel. If you'd like to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can support the channel. The links are in the description. Thank you.